Hello, in this tutorial we will be looking at integrating OpenAI's new ChatGPT-4 vision into a simple app. The app we are going to build will enable us to upload an image, ask a question, this will send the image and the question off to OpenAI, and their API will interpret the image and respond with suggestions based on the question asked. So in this case, I asked, how can I make this room more cozy? And it's given us a load of suggestions for making the room more cozy. Now, I've made this tutorial from the point of view of someone who has never really used the Bubble API connector before or used any of OpenAI's APIs, so it may be a bit slow for some of you, but hopefully for those of you who are beginners, it will be a nice and fairly simple introduction into using APIs with Bubble. So let's get started. Right, so I'm starting with a completely fresh Bubble app, and all I've done is on the index page, I've made a very simple UI which consists of a title, a group, and within the group we have a standard image uploader, and then we have a standard input box here to add some context, and then a button which says get ideas, and the button has no workflow at the moment. And then below that I have a group with a content type of text. So if you've never used this before or never done this before, within Bubble, any group that you have on your page can have a type of content. And that can be things like text, numbers, dates, and so on, or it could be any data type that you have in your database. And you can either set the data source however you want, or you can leave it empty and then send data to it in a workflow. And this is just a really handy way of storing data temporarily on your page, which you can then use elsewhere on the page. So it's very good for any kind of calculations, anytime you want to display something temporarily. All this data will be lost when the page is reloaded, but I definitely use this technique all the time. So if you're not familiar with it, definitely try it out. So the benefit of using it here is that the text within this group, I've just said, is equal to parent group's text. And at the moment that is empty because this data source is empty. But when we run this workflow here, we are then going to say display the data that we get from OpenAI in this group result, and then the text will show here. And on this group, I have also put a conditional here so that it is invisible by default and is only visible when this group's text is not empty. So then if we go to preview this, this is what it looks like. Currently it doesn't do anything, so now we're going to have to go back and add the workflows. So the first thing to do is to go to OpenAI, which is platform.openai.com, and create an account there. And you'll then be able to see the API reference documentation. So there are two main tabs here. There's documentation, which explains everything in really clear, plain English about what their APIs do. And then there's the API reference, which is more technical. So if you've never read API documentation before, I know it is very daunting, and it took me years to get used to reading it, but once I started actually going bit by bit and trying to understand everything, I found it wasn't as bad as I thought. And now, after reading a fair few API docs, I see all the similarities, and I realize that actually I shouldn't have been as scared of it as I was. And the good thing about OpenAI is that they write very clear documentation. So this part here is definitely worth reading because it is all written in very easy to understand plain English. The part we are very interested in now is models. So this lists all the different AI models that OpenAI gives you access to through their API. So you have the ones that we're going to look at today, which is GPT-4 and GPT-4-turbo, but you also have DALL-E, which can generate really nice images from a text prompt. You have text-to-speech, which will use an AI voice to speak any text you give it. And you have Whisper, which will transcribe any spoken audio that you feed it. And then you have a couple of other ones like embeddings and moderation, which are slightly more niche use cases. So the ones we're interested in today are GPT-4 and GPT-4-turbo. Previously, I was using regular GPT-4, and the limitation of that was that it had a context window maximum of 8,192 tokens. So that essentially limits the amount of text that you can feed it as a prompt. So this became an issue when you wanted to feed it very long prompts with lots of information, or if you'd created a chatbot and there was a back and forth conversation and you were constantly having to send it the historic conversation, which was getting longer and longer. At some point you would exhaust this token limit and it would just stop working. And the benefit of the new models is that they have a context window which is much larger, 128,000 tokens, so that's 16 times larger than before. And they say you should be able to feed it 300 pages of standard text, which is essentially you can feed it a book and then ask it questions about that book. So that's super cool. The other cool things about the new model is that it has improved instruction following, which is obviously going to be a good thing. It's also cheaper, so between 2 and 3 times cheaper than previous models. And the other really cool thing is that you can now use this model that has the new OpenAI vision capability, which means it can interpret images, and obviously that opens up a whole world of opportunities in terms of the apps you can build, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. So as they say there, it's a preview model. It's not ready for production traffic, but we can certainly play around with it, and you can use it in test apps and for small amounts of data. The other thing to note is that this is only available for paying developers at the moment. So you need to have a paid OpenAI account. It's only about $20 a month. So if you don't have one, I highly recommend upgrading to that, because you get to play with all these cool toys and can hopefully end up making an app that you can monetize from them. So now I'm going to go back and we're going to go to the API reference documentation. So this is where you get the actual instructions that you will need to interact with their API. So as with all API documentation, you will see some information here of how to install it if you're using Python or Node.js. If you're using Bubble, this is not relevant to you, so you can ignore it. But the thing that is relevant to us is authentication, because this is essentially how the API is going to know that you have a paid OpenAI account and should be allowed to use it. So before we continue with this, let's go back to Bubble and install our API connector. So if you go to the plugins tab and go to add plugins, and the first one there will be called API connector, and it's by Bubble. So this is a legendary plugin which enables you to connect to almost any API you can think of. So the first thing I'm going to do is click add another API here, and I'm going to change this to OpenAI. And then the next thing you see is that it says authentication, and here we have a drop down with a list of different kinds of authentication that APIs commonly use. So if we go back to our documentation here, we can see that it says here, all API requests should include your API key in an authorization HTTP header as follows. So based on using lots of APIs, I know that this means I should select the private key in header option. And this is by far the most common kind of authentication that APIs require. So if it's asking you to put your API key in and you're not sure, usually it will be private key in header. And you can see as we've selected that in the dropdown, it's already given us this key name authorization, which is exactly what they want here. And then it tells you the format that it's expecting. So it needs the word bearer with a capital B, then a space, and then your OpenAI API key, which we are going to get in a second. So I'm going to copy this and paste it in here, and then we're going to replace that with our API key in a bit. So now that we've looked at authorization, the next thing is to find the endpoint that we want to use. So you can see here you've got all the different endpoints, and they explain what they do. You can create speech from text, you can create a transcription, so that's using the Whisper API. They have the regular chat ones, which are usually the most commonly used ones, and then they have things like embeddings, fine tunings. So I had a quick look in the images one, and it's not actually what we want. The images one is more around image generation, so that will be using the DALL-E API. So I went back to documentation and looked down the menu till I found vision, and then if you read here, it tells you more about how the API works. So this is all written in very easy to understand English, so I highly recommend reading this anyway. But essentially what it says is that GPT-4 with vision is available via the GPT-4 vision preview model and the chat completions API, which has been updated to support image inputs. Okay, so what they're saying is there is not a separate endpoint to use this vision functionality. You actually use the chat completions endpoint and then somehow send it an image. So if we keep reading on down, it says images are made available to the model in two main ways: by passing a link to the image or by passing the base 64 encoded image directly in the request. Images can be passed in the user, system, or assistant messages. And here they give a helpful example of how they send through an image to the API. So you can see here we've got a user has asked the question, what is in this image? And then they've attached this object which has a type of image URL, and then they've given the actual image URL. So this is going to be helpful to us in a minute. But first, let's set up the chat completion API. So if we go back here and go to chat and go to chat completion, so create chat completion. So this is a very standard format for API documentation. At the top, it gives you the API endpoint, which is just a URL, which we are going to send our request to, and it tells you the type of request. So in this case, it's a post request. And then below that, it gives you all the variables that you can send through in this API call. Now, most of these will not be relevant or you won't want to use them, but it's worth being aware of the ones that you may want to use. But in most situations, I do not use many of these at all. So we're not going to read through all this now, but instead we're going to look on the right hand side where they have an example request and a response that you can expect back. So the example request here is written in curl, which is a command line language, which basically enables you to kind of hit this API endpoint without actually building an app. You can just do it from the command line on your computer. I've never actually done it that way, but the helpful thing is that Bubble allows you to just copy and paste this into the API connector. And we don't want the default one, we actually want the image input example, which is perfect because it tells us exactly the formatting and the syntax that we need to use in order to upload an image to this. So then we can just copy this curl and go back to our API connector and click import another call from curl. And then we just paste in everything we copied and click import. And what that does is set up the call for us. So this has taken some of the legwork away from us, but just to show you effectively what it's done is, if I go back here, you can see at the top here where it says curl, and then it has the endpoint, which is this exact endpoint here. And then it has this H, which is header information, and it has said content type, application/JSON, and then authorization bearer, and then API key. So it has just told Bubble that I want to put the headers content type and the value of application JSON and authorization bearer OpenAI key. So it has created those things for us based on that curl. And then here where it says D, that is the data that we're going to pass through, and it has essentially just copied this, excluding the little single quote marks, and pasted that in here. So we could have done exactly the same thing almost as quickly, but that is a nice way of doing things if it works. Sometimes it doesn't work, so it's always worth checking through this very carefully to make sure it's got everything right. Now, because we already included our authentication up here, authorization, and we're going to put our API key in here, we don't need it here because this information is shared across all the API calls that we have within this instance of the API connector. So I can actually delete this one, and content type, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to add it as a shared header up here, because that means we can add more and more different calls for OpenAI, and we won't need to put that in every one. So this is going to be standard, and this is going to be standard and shared across all the API calls. So therefore we can now delete that as well. The other thing we want to do is to rename it to something more meaningful, because we're going to want to find this from our workflows. So let's call it analyze image, and use as, you get two options, data or action. In our case, we want to use it in a workflow, so we're going to use it as an action. But if you wanted to use it as data instead, you could select that. And then the next thing we're going to do is come down to this JSON body. Now I know JSON can be a bit intimidating, and certainly it looks a bit like code, but really all it is a structured way of sending data through to the API in the way that the API can understand and expects to receive it. So all you need to know is that all of the syntax you see here, so these quote marks here and here, the colons, the square brackets, the curly braces, they are all very important. And if you accidentally delete one of those or don't have one in the right place, then it just won't work, because it is very particular about the way this data comes through. So things like commas at the end of lines and not having a comma at the end of the last line, this can make or break your API call. So just try and keep things exactly as they are, and not mess around with anything unless you understand what you're doing. So in our case, we don't want to mess around too much, but we do want to make some of these things dynamic. We don't just always want to send through the same question and the same URL. We want our users to be able to edit this or change this information from the front end of the app. So as it says here, you should use pointy brackets for dynamic values. So what we are going to do here is we're going to replace this with the word prompt within pointy brackets. So that is going to make this a variable. And notice that I also replaced the speech marks, because we are going to put those in. And the other thing we want to replace is the image URL. So let's just do that. So I've replaced all that, including the speech marks, with image URL. So it could be anything, as long as we recognize it on the front end. And you'll see once you do that and you click outside the box, then it creates these two inputs below, which is where you are going to put in the values so we can test this. First thing we want to do is untick private, because when private is ticked, that means we won't be able to alter these values from within our app. So if we untick private, then that means we will be able to make these into dynamic values. But for now, we need to first initialize the call, and that means we are just doing a test call to this API and receiving the response back so that Bubble can ask you to tell it how to read that response. So in order to do that, we have to put in some test data. So I'm going to say again, what is in this image? And notice I put the quote marks around because that's what it is expecting in here. And then I also need an image URL. So I've just gone to Google and found a random image, and here is the URL, which I'm going to put inside speech marks. And then the final thing we need to do before initializing this is that we need to add in our actual API key. So if we go back to OpenAI and we go to API keys, and here we can click create a new key, give it a name, and then copy your API key and go back to Bubble. And we're just going to paste it there. So that API key will be used across all of our OpenAI API calls. And the other good thing about having it up here is it's always going to be kept private. There's no risk that you might accidentally forget to tick the private box and show it to people on the front end of your app. So I always recommend doing it in this kind of shared authentication part here rather than down within the call itself as a header. I'm just going to expand this and delete this API call because we're not using it. Okay, so now we've got our API call. It's ready to go. I don't know why this doesn't show up unless you click inside it, but it's all there. And before we do that, I remember them saying in the docs that they give you a very low token limit to start with. So I'm just going to increase this to 4,000 just because there's no need to limit ourselves at this point. So click initialize call. So this is sending this test information over to their API. From their API's perspective, they won't know that it's a test call, but from ours we do. And then Bubble receives a response back and it shows it to you. It shows you what it's received and it tries to guess what type of data each thing is that it's got back. So we can see here the ID that it received back, and it said, I think that's text, and the object thinks it's text. Created, this is actually a date. Whenever you see a number and it's normally called created or something like that, it's actually a date, and Bubble always gets that wrong, so I'm going to change that to date just in case we want the created date. the model that was used, the usage prompt, the usage tokens, and so on. All of this might be useful to us. But other than that, everything looks fine. And we can also click here to see the raw data that it received back. And as you can see, it received back this message from OpenAI. So this is the description of the test image that we sent through to it. So once we are happy that we have chosen the right options for this data, and if there's a really long list, you don't have to go through everything. If just do the fields that you know you are going to use. So once you're happy with that, click Save. This call is now initialized, and that means we will be able to use it from inside our app. So the next thing to do is go back to our Design tab and actually add the workflow here that's going to do what we want. So let's click on this button and click Add Workflow. Now, if you recall, the Vision API gave us two options. It said we could either send a URL of an image, or we could actually upload the image directly to OpenAI as a base 64 encoded image. I think the easier of those two options will be to save the image in the Bubble database and then send the URL to OpenAI. So let's do that. So let's create a new data type called image upload, and we'll give it two fields. So one will be image, and that is going to be of type image, and the other one is going to be question, and that is going to be type text. So we can save the history of the questions that have been asked and the images that have been uploaded. And we could also add a field in here called response, which is going to be text. Then if we go back to our workflow, so when someone clicks that button, we want to create a new thing, create an image upload, add all fields. So the image we want to add is going to be picture uploader A's value. The question is going to be input A's value, and the response, well, we don't know that yet, so I'm just going to delete that. Then the next thing we want to do is actually make the OpenAI API call. So if we go to our plugins, we will see here a list of all the API calls that we have in our API connector. So here, this is the name that we gave to the overall API call group, and then this is the name we gave to the individual API call. So OpenAI analyze image. And then you can see here it gives us two fields that we can complete, and within those fields it has the test data that we used in our original API call. So what we're going to do is make this dynamic. So insert dynamic data, and let's make it equal to the result of step one's question. And very importantly, we are going to say formatted as JSON safe. So that just removes any characters that might confuse the JSON formatting, which, as I said, is very particular. So for example, if someone put speech marks within their question, that would completely confuse the JSON and it wouldn't work. But by using this formatted as JSON safe operator, it will strip out all of those characters and replace them with JSON safe characters, and it will also wrap all of this in quote marks, so we don't need to do that. And then for the image URL, let's get the result of step one's images URL, and let's also format that as JSON safe, which will just wrap that in quote marks. So because we are doing the quote marks here, that is why in our API connector we deleted out the quote marks here. Otherwise you'd have double quote marks, and again that would completely break it. So now let's go back to our workflow. So now we want to get the result of this once it's finished. So what we're going to do is make changes to a thing. So let's make changes to the result of step one, and the field we're going to change is response, and that is going to be equal to the result of step two, choices, first items, message content. And the reason you do this is because OpenAI, I think at some point in the past, they envisaged that they would give you back multiple different choices of responses from their API, and you would be able to choose these. They are not using that functionality at all, as far as I know, which is why you always select choices, first item, and that is the one that is going to have the actual content that you're trying to get at. So that is currently the case across all of their models. And then step 4, we are going to just display the data in our group. So we called it group result, and we are going to display, we could either choose the result of step 2 or step 3. So I'm going to say result of step 3's response. So that will just show the response to us on the page. And then of course we can reset relevant inputs. So those are reset for next time. And that should be all we need. So let's test it out. So reload this page. So I've got a few images here that I downloaded from a free stock photography website. So let's upload one of these. So a standard kind of living room, and then ask a question. How can I make this look more 1970s? Right, okay, so we've got an error. Invalid image. Okay, so I could just edit out this error, but I'm going to actually show you my process for debugging, because whenever you're working with APIs, you will always get errors like that. And it's really useful to be able to understand how to debug those. So the first thing I can do is click on this little red triangle here, which is going to give me a bit more information. So OpenAI returned an error, and it just said invalid image. Okay, so it doesn't tell us much more, but I can go into my app here and I can click on to logs, and I can click search for stuff that's happened within the last 2 minutes. And I can see here button A was clicked. It created a new image upload. This was the image and this was the question that I asked, and then it tried to do this API call here, and the prompt was, how can I make this look more 1970s, which looks fine. And the image URL was this, and then we got the error, the workflow error, image not valid. So if I look at this, it looks like it has sent through the URL without the usual HTTPS colon at the start of it, which means OpenAI is probably not reading this correctly as a URL. So what I can do is I can just add that in manually into the workflow. So let's go back here and go to where we're analyzing the image here. So let's see if we want to format it as JSON safe, but also add in kind of some text here, because really we want it to have that at the start. But if we have formatted as JSON safe here, it's only going to apply it to this dynamic piece here. So it will put in a quotation mark here, which is not what we want. So I'm going to clear that out, and instead I'm going to say arbitrary text. So this just enables you to put in kind of longer text than you would put in there, but it's also kind of useful for stuff like this. So HTTPS colon, then result of step 1's images URL. Then I'm going to close that, and I'm going to format the whole thing as JSON safe. So that will then put the quote marks around the outside of it. So let's give that another try. So get rid of that. So I'm going to upload the image again. How can I make this look more 1970s? So it hasn't failed, so it seems to be doing something. And voila, it has given us an answer. So consider making the following changes: color palette, furniture, fabrics and textures, wall decor, and so on. So it has clearly looked at the photo and understood what's in it, and then given us these suggestions. So let's try another image. What's that one? So this is an empty room. What furniture would you recommend putting in this space? And obviously the user experience is not ideal, because one, we don't have any kind of thing telling them that it's doing something apart from the loading bar at the top, but also we delete out the image, which means we can't look at it when we're reading the the suggestions they given, but they said this space has traditional Japanese elements such as tatami flooring and shoji sliding doors. So yes, we can tell from that it has actually looked at that image. Let's just go back here and stop it from resetting the inputs at the end. And let's try with one more image. What would you suggest for making this room look more futuristic? Great, and so now it's given us some suggestions on how to make this room look more futuristic. So that's really all there is to it. We've integrated GPT Vision into our app. There are tons and tons of different use cases for this technology, so I hope this has been useful to you. Apologies if it went into too much detail about APIs and things like that, but I always like to explain things thoroughly. If you want to find out more about building with Bubble or integrating OpenAI with apps, I do have a new course out. Just check out the link in the description. It's zerotoprocourse.com. Thanks for watching.